I've run into more scrapers getting flagged for touching a disallowed path than I've seen actually get sued over it. And that tells you something about where the real risk sits. I build and run proxy farms and production scrapers for a living across mobile and residential pools, and I read robots.txt files before I point any of that infrastructure at a new target. This isn't theory for me. It's the first file I check on every single job, and getting it wrong has cost me blocked IP ranges more than once. So let's walk through what it actually is, what it does and doesn't enforce, and what actually binds you when you're the one running the requests. Start with the basics. Robots.txt is a plain text file sitting at the root of a domain, something like example.com/robots.txt. It comes out of the Robots Exclusion Protocol, a convention from the mid-1990s, way before anyone tried to build legal frameworks on top of scraping. There's no authentication on this file, no cryptographic signature, nothing forcing any client anywhere to read it, let alone obey it. Think of it less like a lock on a door and more like a handwritten note taped to that door. It's a request, not a mechanism. Structurally, it's simple. The file is broken into blocks, and each block starts with a user agent line naming which crawler the rules below it apply to. After that, you get allow and disallow lines listing which paths that crawler can or can't touch. If you see user agent star, that's the wildcard. It applies to anybody not named more specifically somewhere else in the file. Some files also throw in a crawl delay directive, which is the site suggesting how many seconds you should wait between requests, and a sitemap line pointing at an XML sitemap which exists to help crawlers find content, not to police anybody. Picture a real one. User agent star disallow/admin disallow/cart allow/products, then a separate block. User agent Googlebot disallow/search crawl delay 5, then a sitemap line at the bottom. You read that top to bottom and the most specific match wins. So if your scraper's user agent string literally matches Googlebot, that second block is the one that applies to you, not the wildcard block above it. If your scraper doesn't match anything named explicitly in the file, you fall under the wildcard. That's the whole mechanic. It's genuinely that mechanical. Now here's the part that trips people up, and it's the most important thing in this whole video. Nothing on the server side automatically enforces robots.txt. It is not a firewall rule. A scraper that completely ignores the file will not throw an error because of that alone. There's no gate that stops the request. What robots.txt actually does is document intent, and that documented intent gets used two very different ways depending on who's reading it on the other end. One reader is well-behaved crawlers, and I mean crawlers built by companies that care about staying off block lists and out of legal trouble. Googlebot parses this file before it crawls anything. Bingbot does the same. Most legitimate SEO and monitoring tools do this automatically, by default, because their whole business model depends on being seen as compliant. They are not doing it because a machine forces them to. They are doing it because it's in their interest to look trustworthy. The other reader is the site's own anti-abuse tooling, and this is the one that actually matters to you as an operator. Plenty of sites cross-reference their request logs against their own robots.txt file. So picture a request hitting a disallowed path carrying a generic or obviously spoofed user agent string. From the site's detection system's point of view, that's a much stronger signal than the exact same request hitting an allowed path, because it shows the requester either never checked the file or checked it and decided to ignore it anyway. That behavior gets folded straight into whatever scoring model the site runs, and it can trigger rate limiting, captures, or straight up IP blocks. So no, the protocol itself doesn't enforce robots.txt, but downstream, the same anti-bot systems you're already trying not to trip over frequently do enforce it, indirectly through pattern matching on your behavior. Now let's get into the legal side, because this is where I hear the most confused takes, usually secondhand, usually from someone who half remembers a headline. Is it legal to ignore robots.txt and is it technically enforced are two completely separate questions with two completely separate answers, and conflating them is how people get themselves into trouble or, just as often, scare themselves out of perfectly reasonable projects. Robots.txt by itself is not a contract. You didn't click a checkbox, you didn't sign anything, you didn't agree to anything just by requesting that text file off a server. Courts that have actually looked at scraping cases, HiQ versus LinkedIn in the US being the one everybody cites, even though its later procedural history softened the original headline result, have generally treated a standalone robots.txt as a norm, a convention, not a binding legal instrument on its own. What does carry real legal weight, separately, and often sitting right alongside robots.txt is a site's terms of service, especially if you had to actively accept those terms to get access in the first place, plus jurisdiction-specific computer access laws, the US Computer Fraud and Abuse Act being the one that comes up constantly in this space. Scraping data from behind a login wall after you agreed to terms that explicitly forbid scraping is a fundamentally different legal exposure than scraping public pages that a robots.txt file happens to disallow. The file itself doesn't create liability on its own. It's evidence of what the site operator communicated to you, and it gets used that way when disputes actually happen, which is meaningfully different from robots.txt being the law. And I want to be straight with you here. None of what I'm saying is legal advice. If a scraping project you're running touches personal data, paywalled content, or anything with real legal stakes attached to it, that's a conversation you need to have with a lawyer who actually knows the relevant jurisdictions, not something you take from a video, mine included. So setting the courtroom hypotheticals aside, here's the practical stack I actually use to decide whether I respect a given robots.txt rule on a job. First, the site's own terms of service. If those explicitly prohibit automated access or scraping, that's the harder line, full stop, and it usually stands independent of whatever robots.txt says. Second, the rate and load signals baked into the file itself. A crawl delay directive or a disallow sitting on a heavy dynamically generated path. Think search results, filtered product listings, anything that's hitting a database fresh on every single request. That's frequently the site telling you plainly which parts of their infrastructure genuinely cannot take crawler load. Ignoring that isn't just a compliance issue on paper, it's a good way to actually degrade the site for real human users and a very good way to get your entire IP range or your whole SN blocked as collateral damage, which then costs everyone else running clean traffic through that same range. Third, data sensitivity. When a robots.txt file disallows something like /user or /account, that's usually marking off personal data, not just protecting server load. I treat those as worth respecting, regardless of what the strict legal exposure looks like, because scraping personal data at scale carries its own separate risk under frameworks like GDPR, and that risk has nothing to do with whether robots.txt is technically binding or not. Fourth, and this one's on you, not the file. What are you actually planning to do with the data once you have it? Read-only competitive price monitoring on public product pages is a completely different risk profile than republishing scraped content wholesale or scraping content sitting behind authentications. Robots.txt doesn't distinguish between those use cases at all. It can't. That judgment call is entirely yours to make. My actual operating rule, the one I default to on every job, is this. Treat every disallow line as binding unless you have a specific, defensible reason not to. And never ever treat the absence of a rule as an invitation to hit a site harder than a careful human user would browsing it normally. There's a second use for robots.txt that has nothing to do with compliance at all, and honestly is the part I find most useful day to day. It's a map. A line like disallow/API/internal tells you an API exists at that exact path, information you might not have found otherwise. A block that names user agent bingbot with different rules than the wildcard block tells you the site is treating crawlers differently based on identity, which almost always means they're checking user agent strings somewhere in their stack, which in turn tells you that spoofing a generic user agent on your scraper is likely getting compared directly against that exact list they published. A crawl delay of 10 seconds on a site that otherwise looks lightly protected is often the single clearest signal you'll get about their real rate tolerance before any other defenses even kick in. Reading that file carefully before you write a single line of scraper code saves real time later. It tells you where not to point requests. It gives you a rough sense of how fast the site is actually willing to be crawled. And sometimes it tells you exactly which parts of their stack are sensitive enough that the site operator bothered sitting down and writing an explicit rule about it. Now, the proxy layer. I want to be really clear about this part because it's where I see people talk themselves into bad decisions. A rotating residential or mobile proxy pool changes what IP address a request appears to come from. That's it. That's all it does. It does nothing whatsoever to the legal or ethical status of the request itself. Routing a scraper that's ignoring a disallow on/account through a clean mobile IP doesn't make that request any more acceptable. All it does is make it harder for the site to immediately identify and block the source. And that is a completely different thing from making the request right. I build proxy infrastructure for a living, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you proxies exist to get you past rules a site has clearly and explicitly posted. They exist for scaling legitimate permitted crawling, so one flaky data center IP range doesn't take down an entire job. So that's the real shape of Robots.txt. Mechanically simple, not enforced by the protocol itself, frequently enforced indirectly by anti-bot systems watching how you behave around it, only sometimes carrying legal weight depending on what else is stacked alongside it, and genuinely useful as a map of a site's infrastructure if you actually sit down and read it before you build anything. I run the proxies behind real scrapers myself. The full written guides and the proxy setups I actually use are at proxyscraping.org, along with more on rotation strategy and how to pick between residential, mobile, and data center pools depending on the workload you're running. Full written guides and tested proxy picks at proxyscraping.org. And if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe for more.